I'm excited to be able to share some of the research that is happening around the place and to give our presenters today an opportunity to share the research in their space. This is the second CERC Research Forum that we'll have run this year. Some of you, as I look around the room, may have been present for the one that we did earlier in the year that we had Dean Bennett's come, and that doubled as a book launch for the CERC book from last year. So welcome. Thank you for coming along. I'm looking around. I'm seeing all sorts of people from different places. I can see that we've got Jean. Thank you for joining us from Adventist Schools Australia. We've got HDR students in the room. We've got Avondale staff. I'm expecting to see adjunct lecturers in here. So yeah, there's all sorts of different stakeholder groups represented today, and I want to thank you for giving up some of your time to share with us. I'm excited about the presentation that you guys are going to hear today. I think we've got 4 vastly different kind of research topics. So we'll hear everything from topics around spiritual well-being and spiritual practices in the leadership of Christian schools. We'll hear things in educational policy spaces. We'll hear an update on a research agenda that's kind of taking place around Christian education. And we've got Lynnette sharing as well in the space of school resistance. So really differing topic areas, all related to the field of education. So I don't want to take up any more of your time. I've promised each of our presenters that they've got 12 or so minutes to share their research. And given that I've taken, that's going to take us through until roughly 10:02. And if anyone's got any questions for any of our presenters after that, we'll have a few minutes to be able to share together. So I'm going to go through in order of what you would have seen in the emails from the research services. We're going to have Dr. Michelle Ralston speak to us first. Then we're going to have Professor Tracie Mafile'o. We're going to have Dr. Lynnette Lounsbury. And we're going to finish with our HDR student that is represented today, Cassandra Pendlebury. So having said that, I'm going to hand over to you, Michelle, as you talk us through your research project. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. These should be seeing the right screen. I'm just moving things out of my way so that I can see it too. Hi, thank you for your interest in my work. I'm excited to share a few research projects that I have been involved in and continue to be so. So first of all, I'm new to Avondale this year, so just a very quick introduction of myself. I'm not going to read everything that's on each slide. You'll be glad about that as you see the following slides. I'm just going to pick keywords, but if I'm boring you, then you can read. So hopefully I am accommodating for everyone's learning style. I completed my PhD last year and graduated from the University of Newcastle, and that's my support team there. My family, Liam, David's my husband, so Liam's my second son, David, me, Joel and Sian. Sian is new to the family. She's going to be marrying our son Joel in December. Joel is a paramedic and Liam is a program designer and has done programming for 2 of those Xbox, PlayStation games, none of which I play, but we're very proud of his achievements in that field. So my research for my PhD was looking at translating the disability standards for education into practice. So that's the legislation that gives us the standards to which all education providers must meet with regard to students with disability. My research looked at primary and high schools. So that was the context. And you can read the primary research questions, and I'm not going to go into all the details of my methodology, but I'll quickly go to the next slide. So my methodology included qualitative and quantitative analysis and putting all of that information together to interpret the information. It started off with an analysis of the disability standards as legislation, and then I looked at documents at a federal and state level to see how the disability standards were reflected in those documents. I then had a survey, and we had open and closed questions there. So we got quantitative as well as quantitative data, and I interviewed some key stakeholders. These are my findings. So very, very basically, the disability standards for education should result in, if you look at this green side over here, consultation with all stakeholders, particularly the student with disability and their family. It should result in equity, transition processes, so as students are moving from year to year or any transition where there is a change, there should be processes built in to support the student with disability. There should be adjustments to their learning implemented, and there should be an IEP, an individualised education program. So what my research found with regard to practice, so answering one of my research questions, was that consultation, which is an absolute must within the disability standards, it's the only aspect of the disability standards that's repeated 5 times. So it's really important. What I found was that only 40%, sorry, did I tell you how many people answered? Yeah, I had 449 respondents, and it was restricted to New South Wales. Anyway, so percentage-wise, only there were 40% of the time parents were not involved in IEPs, and that is contradictory to the law, very simply. So 40% of the schools represented here were not meeting basic legislative requirements. Interestingly, the teachers who missed out on consultation or staff were librarians, were rarely told that they had a student in the classroom or in the library who had a disability and that there are adjustments that were needed. And the other people who missed out were the learning support officers. And that's interesting that the other term for that is teachers' aides. It's interesting because the teachers' aides are usually given the job of implementing the reasonable adjustments in the IEP, and yet they weren't involved in the consultation process. I could get into a lot of detail about my findings with practice, but I'm just highlighting a couple of the interesting ones. Within the adjustments here, the curriculum and the physical environment tended to be changed and adapted for the student with disability, but playground activities and teaching strategies and assessments were rarely adjusted, which again is in direct contradiction to the law. And the IEP data gave me some very worrying information, and that was that even though the IEP said these resources need to be used for the student with disability, in 40% of the time, students were not getting, those resources were not being used. And in 37% of the time, the strategies that were listed in the IEP were not being implemented either. And often the reason for that was because the people, like the teachers' aides, did not have access to the IEP, so they didn't know what strategies they were supposed to be implementing. So I discovered a whole lot of difficulties there. But the other aspect was what influences practice that is aligned with the disability standards. And the quantitative analysis showed that the key enabler was the culture of the school. So you can see those blue lines there indicate that the culture of the school enabled consultation, equity, transition, adjustments and IEPs to all occur. It was the only key enabler from the exploratory factor analysis and multiple regression. Understanding of the DSC, so actually understanding what the legislation was, improved consultation actually occurring, adjustments being implemented, and an IEP being written. And attitude to inclusion only influenced whether adjustments were implemented, and that tended to be within the classroom. The other two enablers that aren't in that regression schema are here on the side with learning and development and policies. And this is because I was a learner and doing my PhD, so there was a problem with my my survey, and my questions about learning and development and policy were only open-ended questions, so only suitable for qualitative analysis. So if I was to repeat this research, I would be having questions that could include that as well. So it's very interesting that the culture of the school is the determinant for what making sure that all of our practices are aligned with the DSE, and the culture included was the principal. The principal was the key factor there. Whether the principal had a clear statement about inclusion of students with disability, if it was a priority, and that priority was known by all of the community. Whether the principal made expectations clear, had accountability, so there were expectations that staff and community members would provide evidence of inclusion of students with disability, and support was implemented for those who weren't enacting those, so that it wasn't seen as a critical aspect of the role of the principal, but a situation where the principal would become aware of practice not happening and then would put in supports to ensure that would happen. Anyway, I've got not very much time left, and I just had so much more to tell you. So I'm going to skip through a few things. The final outcomes was that I made 77 recommendations for amendments within the actual legislation. There are contradictions within it, and it's too hard for people to understand, so that they implement it. And I've sort of talked through those other things, and I've had several publications, and I want to get more. That led me to be invited into an AITSL project that I was involved in at the beginning of the year. You can read that information, but that resulted in AITSL adopting 8 elaborations to help teachers know how to meet the disability standards as part of their accreditation process. The report that I wrote was disseminated to AITSL staff because a lot of them did not understand the basics of what the DSE required. And I also developed a 2 templates which have become national resources. So the procedure to determine a reasonable adjustment and a reasonable adjustment plan template. So I'm very proud of those achievements that have come directly from my thesis. I was going to tell you about another research project, but I'm going to leave that for next year when it's actually published. My final one leads nicely to Tracie, because I have become involved in the project about developing a research agenda. So I'm going to hand over now to Tracie, who can explain that research, if that's okay. I'm just going to stop sharing. Sorry, it was a bit rushed. I knew it would be.
You did well, Michelle. Thank you. And I do apologise. I should have mentioned Michelle is new on the staff this year. Tracie also has come on this year. She came on, I think, at the end of last year. It would have been Tracie, I think. But
no, end of January this year.
Oh, January it was? Okay, sorry. I was referring to the email that alerted us that you were going to be joining us. Sorry. Yeah, so Tracie's also new, and yeah, really interesting. All of these projects that you're going to hear about today are obviously at different life stages. So Tracie's going to share a little bit about one that's just kind of starting to get underway now. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and good afternoon. I have to think twice because sometimes it's morning there and it's afternoon here, but we're all in the afternoon, so we're safe. This presentation's about this project, which is currently being implemented. And the research aim is to develop a research agenda for collaborative and impactful research for Adventist ministry in education in Australia and New Zealand. So really happy to have my team members pictured here. Thank you, Michelle. It's been great working beside you. Also have Dr. Erika Puni from staff on Avondale. And then two others, Dr. Branimir Schubert and then Daniela Brown, Bethlehem Tertiary Institute, which is in here in New Zealand. But she's also a previous Adventist educator in our Adventist system as well. And a Avondale Uni alumnus. Right. Okay. So as researchers, sometimes we hear those criticisms by those who are in practice, maybe in ministry roles or in teaching or administration, leadership or policy, that our research is top down and lacking real world impact. So sometimes, how many times have our topics for research come from our expert knowing of the literature, a few steps removed from those who would be the desired end users of our knowledge production, of our research. So sometimes the formulation of our research topics can be a little bit top down. And the problem with this is that the research may lack relevance for those at the coalface and those who are on the ground in practice. Across a range of disciplines though, researchers are seeking to break from the traditional top-down research approach and are advocating for strong collaborations between researchers and communities of practice, a push for shared ownership of research processes and outcomes. And just as these education scholars have noted, there's a call for education research that is in closer dialogue with policy and practice, and to improve the use of evidence. And there's a big push across a whole range of disciplines for evidence-informed, evidence-based practice. The improvement in the use of evidence depends on people in communities and schools having a say in what questions are asked and what research is conducted. So that's something of the rationale for this project. So this diagram from Fuchs is from a book she wrote about research partnerships. And I just think it's a really great diagram showing that traditional model of research. We have research experts who produce knowledge and then disseminate that knowledge for adoption. But what, a more contemporary approach, these researchers and practitioners working more collaboratively in all facets of the knowledge production cycle, from appraising the existing knowledge to knowledge creation, validation, adoption, and dissemination. So collaborative ground-up knowledge production, I think, can help Adventist ministry and education be responsive and effective in a constantly changing and challenging social and professional context that we find ourselves in. And I'm sure we all know our university's research plan, which has as one of the goals applied multidisciplinary research that addresses real-world challenges through strategic partnerships. So one way we can address real-world challenges is through collaborative research and engagement with stakeholders, including in schools. So what are we seeking to do? Here is our aim, and I guess 3 objectives. We want to, we're engaging ministers, educators, leaders employed by the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Australia and New Zealand, just to kind of be able to start somewhere and to be logistically feasible. So we're looking at identifying the key research questions and topics which, if addressed, would make an impact, would positively impact ministry and education. we want to produce a research agenda that could be used to inform faculty research at Avondale University and that of postgraduate researchers as well. And in the process, we want to facilitate and build mutually beneficial collaborative partnerships. Just by having the dialogue and the discussion, perhaps there could be some ideas sparked and some ways of working together between researchers and practitioners. So our approach to this project is wholly qualitative, where we've conducted focus groups, and we've been present at 2 key events. One was the New Zealand Pacific Union Mission Ministers meetings in Auckland, New Zealand, and the other was the Education Leaders Conference for Adventist educators, leaders in Australia and New Zealand. I just want to thank Dr. Jean Carter, who I saw here, for the opportunity to be present at that. And so there are several focus groups which have been completed, but we're still going. We're also using individual interviews, just being able to take the opportunities that present. We had hoped that we might be able to use the World Cafe method, which is great for engaging perspectives and dialogue amongst large groups, but it doesn't look like that opportunity will present itself in this project. Our analysis will be reflexive thematic analysis, following Braun and Clark, with 6 stages of analysis: familiarization, generating codes, constructing themes, revising themes, defining themes, and producing the report. So this is just the approach that we've taken with our focus groups. So starting with introductions, inviting reflections on practice scenarios where more understanding, insight, or data was needed. And then asking people to talk about the biggest challenge of Adventist ministry education and what research they think could help address those challenges. So we asked about their everyday practice, and then we asked for for bigger picture thinking. And then we also inquire how they would like to best engage in research to give us insight about building mutually beneficial collaborative research partnerships. So I won't dwell on this, but these are the emerging themes in terms of the pastors and the ministry leaders that we spoke to. But because of time, I'm just going to flick so you can spend a bit more time looking at what has come up in terms of education so far. So chaplaincy was an area that was discussed: career pathway, isolation and support, the impact on teachers, pastoral care role. And perhaps this came because some of the topics that were in the front and centre for education leaders at the recent conference, but challenges around dealing with sexuality in schools and aligning pastoral care with theology and policy and framework, curriculum, achievement, concern with are we really measuring and understanding the achievement that's happening in our schools, church leaders' perceptions of Adventist education, and then more recently this idea of identity and holistic education. I thought that needs to be more fully examined for the 21st century. And how does our concept of service, what are the implications of our concept of service for the education system? So this data collection is still ongoing. In fact, there's going to be some here in New Zealand, I think on Monday, coming up in a few days. So it's exciting to see, the different perspectives that will be coming forward from teachers. So that's really briefly it. We're hoping to be able to finish up data collection. We still have to engage, I think, ministers in Australia as well. We've kind of satisfied that we'll be able to do that in New Zealand, and then go through analysis and drafting our agenda, and then sense checking it, and then writing a journal article. There's just a short bibliography there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm going to be watching the results of that with interest. It could have implications for, a lot of us staff here at Avondale in our research spaces. You did give me one little bit of homework though, because I wasn't familiar with the World Cafe method. And I've just done a quick Google search in the back. I thought I'd just share it if anyone else wasn't familiar with it. The World Cafe methodology is based on the belief that we are wiser together and that the future can be shaped through conversations that matter. So I love that approach that you've taken.
Love it too.
Research agenda.
Thank you.
Well, I'm just going to introduce Dr. Lynnette Lounsbury. She's going to be our next presenter. And I want to thank you, Lynnette, because for those who may not know Lynnette, I don't think, Lynnette, there's probably too much of your research that's necessarily been in the education space. Am I correct? I know that you kind of
you're right. You're right.
Creative background.
Yeah.
But I'm very mindful that Lynnette has something big. I don't know if I should be mentioning it here, Lynnette, or not. Big celebration at the moment. She's had recent great news. Do you just want to share a little bit on that? I know it's not related to this project, but something else. But
Oh, the film project.
Yeah.
Yes, we just got Screen New South Wales early development funding for a project that I'm working on called Daydreamers, a film that will be shot in regional New South Wales. And the other producer is actually someone who's on this team for this research. So, we're doing a few things together.
Awesome. Well, yeah, as I said, I think Lynnette's research is often more in that creative kind of space. Today, she's going to share a little bit of the research that she's doing in the school resistance space. So I'm going to hand over to you, Lynnette, and
Sure.
thanks for sharing.
I'm going to share my screen here. All right. And where's got so many things going on this screen. Away from start. All right. This came about with a group of women that I was in a PhD club with, because we were all doing our PhD at the same time and over COVID. Bianca Costigan, who's with us today, and she'll chime in a little bit later. She's doing her PhD with University of Canberra, but she is an ex-Avondale student. She is a sessional lecturer here for some of the arts courses, and she's a research assistant here as well. And Eliza Wells, who is a lecturer from COFA, New South Wales, UNSW COFA, and she is an author, a psychologist, and an arts therapist. And this project came up because we've all had both educational experience with school refusal and school resistance and personal in our families. So it was something we were really fascinated with and had done an enormous amount of reading on individually. And so we decided to come together as a research project. And so far, we've got 3 or 4 things on the go, but we've been working on 2 theoretical papers to start off. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Our first of the 2 papers was something called New Thoughts on School Refusal. And that was just what's happening in this space, what are the terms, who's doing the research. We had 3 case studies from parents talking about their experience with it, and then some ideas, some basic ideas for teachers. So this paper was directed towards teachers. And the second paper, which we've finished a draft of, it's not quite done, is Managing Supporting School Refusal from Students During a Collective Time of Crisis, an analysis of teacher preparedness and support. This arose out of Bianca's research, which is about teachers dealing with these sorts of things, crisis and trauma, and all the problems that can get in the way of teaching. So the first paper is essentially, we start with this definition. There's so many terms around school refusal. School resistance is another one. School phobias, school avoidance. And we look at this issue that affects a significant proportion. It's about 5% at the moment of school-aged children. And it's interesting because it is across just about every factor that might separate students. It's across financial divides, racial divides, social divides. It's anyone can deal with this. We look at its impact on schools, students, families, and we present the case studies, the diverse experiences, And then we look at some research and findings of educators that might be useful to educators. The research, we broke it up into understanding it. Just one second. Perfect time for a visitor. Primarily affecting children who are aged 5 to 17. It looks at reluctance or refusal to attend school, emotional distress associated with that because it's huge. It's distress for the student, it's distress for the teachers, the parents in particular suffer in these situations. And then we look at the prevalence and impact of it. It is a growing problem. It seems to be expanding every year, and COVID exacerbated it. And then we look at the factors contributing to it, in particular, individual, family, school, and community factors. And all of those feed together. Sometimes the community factors are huge. What your community expects of you out of education can change the way you engage with education. And then we had 3 anonymized case studies that just kind of describe the sort of experiences people have when their child is school resistant and refuses to go to school. Our second paper, and this is the one we're still working on, it looks at a recap to start with what is school refusal. We do that again with a more detailed literary study there. And then we look at the ways in which COVID-19 exacerbated the problem. It focuses on Australian students, but we do look at some international case studies and statistics. We went on to look at teacher stress during this period, which was huge. The ways in which this time made it harder for teachers to deal with students who were avoidant. And then we finished with suggestions for teacher preparedness and support. And this is where I might ask Bianca if she wants to talk a little bit about this paper that we've been working on.
Sure. So research was pretty quick to emerge regarding the impact of COVID on students, but was quite slow coming forward internationally on the impact on teachers. And obviously what's been found worldwide is that COVID was a really difficult time for everybody to manage their well-being, let alone managing a classroom of other people, let alone homeschooling your own children while managing. So it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. So essentially, it was like COVID just held a magnifying glass up for all of the challenges that are there for families experiencing school resistance. And it really shone a light on, you know, the things that work well and the things that don't work well. But unfortunately, I think the fuel for supporting students was regularly dropping because of the exacerbation of stress and psychological distress for teachers worldwide. And so what we found is that another challenge on top of that is that often the teachers were left to pick up the pieces. Teachers are feeling that the bulk of this problem is on them, and that there's a real disjoin between parents, between teachers, between admin, and then the support that links them all together.
And we found this in the research, but also in the case studies where parents were blamed, or conversely, teachers were misinformed about what was happening. And the administration may have one message and not be connecting dots. And it just, things were falling apart on an administrative level, which made it even harder for the students.
Yeah, very much so. And I think like what came out is that there really needs to be an individualized, compassionate approach for teachers moving forward, which is really difficult when we're living in a time of intense compassion fatigue for educators. There's a lot of changes that happened very quickly and a lot of change to teaching practice, and that languishing, we've not really caught up on coping, but that compassion at the forefront of connection with students is paramount in the success of managing school refusal. And also the research showed that the approach, while there needs to be compassion at the forefront, has to be individualized. So what works for one student is absolutely not going to work for another student. And we're looking at kind, gentle, tailored approaches based on gentle affirming practice rather than reactive repercussions. And that includes the support from admin as well. So, and that trickles into the second point, which is that without a united approach, we don't have success in this. Without teachers feeling that they've got the support from home, without home feeling like they're not being blamed for these disrespectful students, and without admin going, this is actually not about students being disrespectful and rude. This is multi-layered. And if we're not supporting the teacher, and we're not supporting the student, and we're not supporting the parents, and we're not supporting like allied professionals coming in, then there's no success here for anybody moving forward. And this has been highlighted significantly in the last 12 months because this is now an issue of national concern for our government, where they're looking at the rising number of school refusal for Australian students, and like the numbers are astronomical. So trying to really focus on that united approach with an individualized perspective on support for the students is paramount for managing school refusal in Australia or worldwide.
Yeah, there's some really interesting ideas coming out of Japan on how to deal with this, which we put in our paper as well. And there's a great Norwegian study that was really valuable. So it's a worldwide problem, but it is starting to get at least the conversations in Australia. I don't know that there's necessarily funding being funneled into it yet, but that's what we're talking about here. So our overall findings is that this problem's growing, it's not going away, and it's extremely complicated. And while I've really only mentioned here our engagement with the literature around schools and teachers, this is also a mental health issue for a lot of students. They have not only the school issues, but then either arising from their school phobias, there will be mental health issues, or there may be underlying issues as well, everything from neurodivergence to trauma responses. So, secondly, teachers play a really vital role in helping students manage these, but they're overworked and they're under-supported, and they've just come out of a time that was pretty much a trauma for teachers. It was a very, very difficult time. There needs to be a united approach with students, parents, mental health teams, admin, and teachers, and that's complicated, and it needs time, and it will need funding. So that's where we're at with that. Our future with this research is, our next step will be trying to spend some time interviewing students who are school resistant and parents. And obviously these are people who may not wish to talk about education. So that we'll be negotiating that field next. And eventually we'd like to put it all together into some sort of book that's for teachers and parents. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynnette, and thanks, Bianca. Welcome back to the Avondale community. Good to see you. Really practical research there, I'm sure you'll agree, and I'm guessing questions for you after we finish our presentations. I just want to introduce Cass. Where are you, Cass? Sorry, I'm looking for your... Oh, yep, gotcha. I just want to introduce Cass. Cass is one of our HDA, our higher degree research students here at Avondale, and she is at an exciting part, I guess, of her research. She is getting through the data analysis and underway with some of the writing in her chapters reporting on that. So her topic is an interesting one. She's going to tell us a little bit about it today, looking at spiritual well-being and spiritual practices in Christian leadership. So Cass, maybe it might be worthwhile, maybe do you just want to give us kind of a 30-second background of your working history to this point and how this topic...
Yeah, sure. I will share screen as well. I've got to figure out which one I'm sharing. So can everybody see that?
Yep.
Before I start talking? Good. I've got a dual career background. It's both education and human resource management consulting. So I kind of have a weird way of perceiving things sometimes. I look at the educational component, but I also look at the organisational component. So it really brought me to looking at this. My previous role, I'm working for Alpha Crucis University College now, and my previous role was with Christian Schools Australia as an exec officer, and had some first-hand experience with principals burning out. And it was a real prompt to go, oh, look, this has to be looked at. And you know how you say those things to God, and then he goes, well, this should be you. And you go, oh, great, thank you. Okay. So it was really, listening to what Tracie was saying earlier, this really was prompted from practical experience, not from a desire to necessarily do research. So yeah, anyway. Okay, now I'm on 2 screens, so we'll just hope that this works effectively with me being on 2 screens. So what I'm looking at for the study is spiritual wellbeing and spiritual practices in the leadership of Australian Christian schools, in the hope that that will help to improve sustainability of leadership. And it's not going to click on. Hang on a sec. I'm going to talk and operate at the same time. I think what I'll do is I'll shut the other screen. That's confusing. In looking at this, it obviously had a bit of a dual focus, and then it prompted me to really look at we go. Okay, talking, speaking, same time, operating machinery. Me to really look at spiritual practices and spiritual well-being and what that actually meant. And then I'm having issues. Peter, you might have to. Have you got it there?
I've got it open in the background. If you just
can you load it up and I'll just talk to it.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm having issues, but I am.
You're right. No worries. If you just stop your
I will.
screen share, I'll see if I can jump in.
It's not even letting me stop screen share at the moment, so that is bizarro. Hang on. It's probably Alpha Crucis technology not wanting to talk to Avondale technology. Okay, hang on.
Yeah, I can't share mine while...
No, and I can't get out of sharing mine. I might have to jump back out and jump back in again.
Okay, no worries. I'll have it ready to go.
Hold the space for me.
Yep.
Not even letting me leave.
Kirsty, are you able to do anything on your end regarding screen share?
I'm not certain, as Cass's screen is still sharing. Oh, there we go.
No worries.
So I can just let her out.
What I might do is just have this ready in the background. Can everyone see? Can someone just confirm for me that they can see this slide?
Yep.
Just work this manually. Yep. Okay. What about if I go full screen? Is that, what are you guys seeing there? Are you seeing her notes as well?
Yeah, I can see the screen. Thanks, Peter.
You can just see the screen there?
Yep.
Okay, no worries. All right, well, I guess we're awaiting Cass to come back in. The joys of technology. By the way, I should disclose, Cass is actually one of my HDR students. And I can see Peter Kay here as well. So we're on her supervisory team, becoming familiar with her space. And yeah, I'll let her give a bit more of an update into what this research is about. Just scrolling through our participants.
So I just had thought while we're waiting, did we want to take any questions now for the other presenters, or?
Yeah, great idea. Did anyone have any questions? I noticed there was some chat comments in relation to each of the projects that we've heard a little bit about. So we might throw the floor open to any questions.
I'm happy to ask a question if we're just waiting. On the school refusal, I found that fascinating. Was there any, and I might have missed it, so my apologies, but was there any specific age that is worse than another age with the school refusal?
It didn't seem like it. It seemed like it's across the age ranges of 5 to 17. There is, it's more associated with mental health images and issues once they hit adolescence, though. That's right, isn't it, Bianca?
Yeah, definitely in those higher years of high school, but it also changes dependent on the school that you're looking at. So the analysis of different country approaches to this issue had varying issues with it. And I think probably the most interesting thing that came out is that the numbers for successful rehabilitation in the classroom were much higher in countries where you don't have criminalisation for parents attached. So that completely changes the way that everything's managed, whether it's a mental health issue or any other reason why that's occurring. But yeah, there's no consistency across the board other than it's a growing issues from kindergarten onwards.
It's quite a bit harder on parents with teenagers because the school expects them to be able to manage a teenager with the communication a little bit better, and the teenagers are much more likely to absolutely refuse to go.
Yeah, and in the case studies, I think what came out really clear as well is kind of relates to that previous presentation about the culture of the school really impacting the way that it's managed, because what was definitely coming out in one of the case studies was that the culture of the school saw it more as a disciplinary, curb this, these are our rules, here's the box fit in it, rather than this is a greater mental health issue that we're working on. So it's kind of challenging to explore and navigate.
Thank you.
Well, Cass, I can see that you're back with us.
Sorry about that, people. I think I blew up the system. Thanks,
All right.
Pete.
No worries. If you just prompt me, I'll scroll through it.
Okay, cool. Next one. Oh, this is like old presenting days. So you know a bit about the catalyst, you know a bit about me. That'll work. I have two lovely tertiary supervisors in Peter Williams and Peter Kilgore, who are both here. Dual career we know about. So it was this question of burnout for me that really prompted the study. If you are familiar at all with the longitudinal principal occupational health, safety and wellbeing study from ACU, they do it every 2 years. And it's just showing an ever increasing level of burnout in principals in schools generally, and particularly in independent schools. Next one. So what I really wanted to do was look at how principals of Australian Christian schools actually perceive spiritual wellbeing, how they also perceive spiritual practices, and whether there is any sense of both those elements and interventions helping with the sustainability of leadership in Christian schools. There's a multiple theory basis to the study, but really it's pragmatism and using grounded theory in the analysis. Thanks, Pete. I've done the initial literature review a while back now, so it needs to be completely relooked at. And as with all studies, you discover all these new things as you go through. The gaps that I found at the beginning of approaching this study was that there were no studies found in educational leadership that included both spiritual wellbeing and spiritual practices. There were no studies in an Australian Christian school context that addressed both of those. And there were definite opportunities for professional development, mentoring, coaching applications. These are the 4 domains that it's actually I used a pre-existing measure from Dr. Fisher, and these were the 4 domains of spiritual wellbeing that we developed a survey and sent out to participants, and their personal spiritual wellbeing, communal spiritual wellbeing, environmental spiritual wellbeing, and transcendental spiritual wellbeing. He's used this instrument in non-Christian circles, and found the term transcendental was more palatable. Next one, and the spiritual practices side of the study, I sent definitions of these prior to interviews on solitude, community, meditation, submission and Sabbath, just from some pre-analysis. The research questions were: how do principals in Australian Christian schools perceive the Shalom spiritual wellbeing elements? How do they perceive spiritual practices? And how may engagement with both of these help sustain principals in Australian Christian schools? Just so you know too, the sample It's all right, it's on this one. The sample included Adventist Education, Christian Schools Australia, Christian Education National, and the Association of Christian Schools. Because I was working for one of those associations, I was very blessed to have access to the heads of the other associations and to be able to speak very closely with Adventist Education. So it was a mixed method study using both the survey instrument and qualitative interviews post-survey that were self-nominated on the survey itself. Just a quick look at the survey measure and the sorts of things that are included in it. What's really interesting is that it is a measure that looks at both what is perceived as ideal for spiritual health and the actuality, lived experience. Pete. And that gap is what Fisher called dissonance. There's a lovely quote there from him. This gap between lived and perceived is where the analysis showed tension. I'll talk to that a bit more. So the key findings from the quantitative phase were that there was actually no significant difference in the demographic factors. So gender, location, longevity in the role, or association, which I found really fascinating. But there were significant differences in this ideal versus lived experience in all the spiritual well-being elements, except environmental spiritual well-being, which is really interesting because when we come to the qualitative component of the study, it is the environmental spiritual well-being element that is least understood or engaged with or grappled with, really. Thanks, Peter. So the gap, as I said, was in all elements between lived and perceived, except environmental. It points to a high level of dissatisfaction with their own spiritual well-being, and they can see that gap and they're very much aware of it, which also is an indicator of potential burnout. They perceived that spiritual well-being was really important, but they really, in many ways, didn't know much about spiritual well-being elements and not a lot about spiritual practices either, which we found in the next phase. Thanks, Peter. So the second phase was the qualitative interviews, and I did Zoom interviews. There were 78 in the survey and 13 Zoom follow-up interviews. And these were the dominant themes: an overall lack of understanding and engagement with the spiritual wellbeing elements and practices, and particularly with environmental spiritual wellbeing. I had to kind of explain that numerous times, and sometimes we had aha moments halfway through with, so when I'm riding my bike in the morning and I'm just, talking to God and enjoying nature, is that environmental spiritual wellbeing? There was the constraint of time was really clearly identified by all the respondents pretty much. And the spiritual practices was interesting because the first things they went to were Bible reading and prayer, even though they were not in the original list and the definitions that I sent through. But they were still really heavily referred to. Meditation was really contentious and not really understood as a Christian spiritual practice. Lots of links to Eastern religions and New Age theology. So the big gap that was discernible was the lack of reference to the spiritual practice of submission. And many of them found that very difficult to actually even talk about. And the understanding of the experience of burnout was very evident in all the responses. And some participants expressed strong links from burnout to their identity and shame and guilt. Obviously, COVID-19 had a huge impact on particularly the community spiritual wellbeing factor, but also overall in all the elements. And they could all, though, express strong possible links to sustainability in their roles and both the spiritual wellbeing elements and spiritual practices. So themes that weren't included in the original questioning protocol but emerged really strongly in the interviews included the impact of the relationship with the board on the principal and the need for mentoring, specifically mentoring that included these things that they weren't particularly aware of, including spiritual wellbeing elements and spiritual practices, not just skills-based coaching. I think I'm done.
Okay, thanks, Cass. We've got a couple of minutes. I'm conscious to make sure that we get you out on time, but are there any questions for any of our 4 presenters today? Just while we've got a few more minutes.
Peter, I have a general question.
Sure.
If we have time.
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether any of the researchers would like to share how their research has changed them as a researcher.
Anyone want to have a crack at that?
Oh, I can speak to this because I'm a newbie.
Good on you,
So I have learned so much, and I'm actually mentoring principals as well. And I've directly applied the research to what I'm doing with mentoring. And I'm using those terms of spiritual wellbeing elements and spiritual practices. And it's been really exciting seeing how it's helped them develop their sustainability in their roles and their relationship with God.
I don't know about better researcher, but it's certainly changed my perspective as a lecturer on my students, the ones that are class avoidant, and as a parent, understanding the issue a bit better, but also as a support for friends whose kids are going through this. It's completely expanded my understanding and compassion.
Thank you. All right, well, I'm conscious of the time, but again, let me thank each and every one of you for coming. I want to say a special thank you to our, and I'm going to say 5 presenters there, with Bianca helping Lynnette out. And yeah, just thank you so much for everyone who's taken the time to come along today and support research that's happening here at Avondale. Yeah, it's really heartwarming for me, I guess, to see so many of you here and interested in the research that is taking place. So thank you, and we'll finish up there. Thank you.